Last week we began to cover the circulatory system with the anatomy of the heart. And this week we'll build on that knowledge by starting to talk about the conduction system of the heart and electrocardiography. Electrocardiography is the process by which we use the impact on an electrical current to understand electrical changes that are occurring within the human body and specifically the heart. So I want to just pull up Blackboard for a second here, and I want to show you the important things for next week that we'll want to take a look at. So there is a file called ECG Heart Sounds Protocol, and we are going to open this up here. It gives you a little bit of a background of the double pump system that the heart is, basically showing you the pulmonary circuit as well as the systemic circuit that blood is being pumped out to. Now, this is important to understand because we really need to coordinate these contractions of the heart in order to enable blood to go in the right direction and to maximize the efficiency of this system. So during this week's lab, what we'll actually do is we will connect a subject to our Power Lab system. So for this week, be prepared to basically have someone who is going to have electrodes connected to them. We are only really requiring that you're connecting a negative, a positive, and an earth or a ground electrode. And there are really two options with this. Your Power Lab systems all come with clamps that are color-coded, and these clamps can simply be attached to the limbs of your subject. So basically we will set this up with the instructions given. Depending on who your instructor is, you may have some different things that you do to simulate some of the leads that we'll learn about. The second option is to use electrodes on the skin directly. Now what this does is it reduces the noise. So we'll have a cleaner signal if we do use electrodes, and we have plenty of electrodes for as many subjects to do it as they want to. So if you've never had your ECG done, please feel free to volunteer for this. It's really a very interesting portion of lab this semester. So please read through this protocol. And we will start to look at how this actually works now. So the conduction system of the heart is absolutely amazing. Really what we're looking at is a organ in the body that can pass an electrical current through it. So it's specifically designed for this purpose, and it actually has fibers called autorhythmic fibers that will set the pace so that we basically have a coordinated contraction in the different chambers to allow blood to be pumped in the direction that we want them to go. So I'm going to begin discussing that, and I am of course Steve Conant. I teach some of the lab sections this semester as well. To begin demystifying the electrocardiograph, I want to make the distinction between the trace of an action potential and an ECG trace. So here we have two different traces, and the one on the bottom represents a ventricular muscle cell action potential. So this is a cardiac muscle cell action potential. And during rest, what we have here is we have a cell that is more negative on the inside and more positive on the outside. So this cell is going to some way reach excitation, and it's going to depolarize. And when this cell depolarizes, it becomes more positive on the inside and more negative on the outside. And then when we come back to rest, we return to that initial state of more negative on the inside and more positive on the outside. Up in this trace, what we're looking at is actually the result of many action potentials going on within the heart. So we're not looking at just one muscle cell. What we're actually looking at is the instantaneous net electrical movement on the outside of the heart. That is what is impacting the current that we're running through the body to create the electrocardiograph recording. So the takeaway from this slide is that we have a resting membrane potential that is more negative on the inside and more positive on the outside. When we depolarize, we become more positive on the inside and more negative on the outside. So this can be looked at as a negative wave sweeping across the outside of the myocardium. Now, how do we actually observe this? Well, that's a good question, and the next slide I think is going to give you some information. So in this slide, we have a man who's sitting there with his right arm in one bucket, his left arm in another bucket, and his left foot in a third bucket. Now, there's salt water in these buckets, and there are wires connected to those buckets. Now, these wires are likely connected to maybe one of the first electrocardiography machines, and this man could very likely switch these wires to either represent a positive or negative charge. So with this, what he's doing is he's actually able to set up a charge difference across the body. And when we have a charge difference, just like we do across a membrane, we call that a dipole. So it's the difference between charge across two different areas, or across an area. So with this man likely has, maybe his right arm here has a negative charge assigned to it through this wire and where it's connected to, and this left leg, maybe it has a positive charge connected to it. So what we can see is that he's set this up so that when this machine is running, he's going to have a current running through his body. And this current is going to be running from the right arm to the left leg. And really interesting thing is that if we have some other type of electrical activity in the body due to this man's heart, what's going to happen is that a force will actually be exerted on the current that is running through his body. So this machine will detect what's going on as far as forces related to that current, and what that does is it gives us a deflection in the trace. So he's looking over here, and he's probably seeing a deflection going in one direction or the other due to the way that the current across his heart is impacting the current that's running through his body from this machine. And I'm going to explain quite a bit more on this, but I think it's really interesting to see how this was done a very long time ago, because the system is going to look very elegant compared to this today. So don't worry about sticking your foot in a bucket or your hands in a bucket or anything else in a bucket this week in lab. So just to talk about and put in writing some of the things that I've mentioned, the electrocardiogram uses electrodes on the surface of the body, and the body acts as a conductor for this signal to go through, this current to go through the body. The ECG does not record individual action potentials. It records the wave of depolarization or the wave of repolarization as it travels across the heart. So what we're actually observing is the wave front that is due to the charge separation, so the dipole that was set up across membrane. So this information is just what I've said in the past, and it's just in writing there for you. So really what that man had set up was probably something like this. So this is called Huggins Triangle, and what we have is we have a way where we can connect the right arm, the left arm, and the left foot to create a number of different views of the body. So specifically views of the heart. So by creating this triangle coordinate system, we can look at the heart from different directions. Very similar to when we're watching a football game and there's an instant replay, and we want to know if the runner's knee was down before the ball came out or something related to that. We want to know if it was a touchdown. Whatever example works for you, we may need to look from an angle from one side of this runner. We may look from another side. We may choose a number of different angles to get the best picture of what's going on. And really, electrocardiography is the same thing. We set up a coordinate system to get as many different views of the heart as we need to determine what's going on in the heart. So this is Huggins Triangle, and it's going to be a little bit confusing when you're first looking at it, but I'm going to try to make it as easy as possible. So on the left over here, what we see is the arrangement of the autorhythmic fibers that are in the heart. And the most important two for right now is going to be the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node right down here. So these two different areas are really what's setting the pace of the heart, first in the atria, then down in the ventricles. So in order to best look at this, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a couple different dipoles. Now the dipole is just the charge difference. Now when we looked at this man in the first slide there, what he had set up was the ability to set up all these different leads. So even though he just connected his right arm, his left arm, and his left leg, what he was able to do was when he changes this, when he assigns maybe the right arm a negative and the left arm a positive, he can simulate a lead 1. So he can simulate a look at the heart, or what's going on in this straight x-axis right here. So what's going on across the heart. Now, very commonly, we will look at lead 2, because lead 2, as you can see, the way the heart is tilted in the body and the way the conduction system of the heart it looks, this is a very good lead for us to look at, to understand and see the deflections going on as we go through each of the different phases of the pumping mechanism of the heart. So from here, the lead 2, we have a negative up here by the right arm, and we have a positive down by the left leg. So this is simulating a lead 2 in the body. Now, again, to go over, we are looking at what's going on at one instant, and we are observing the net electrical dipole of the wave of depolarization moving across the outside of the myocardium. What I like to remember with this, because you will have to know what Huggins Triangle looks like, you may have to reproduce this for an exam. What I try to think about is setting it up, just trying to make it as easy as possible. I think that what I want to do is try to put all of the positive charges as far as I can get them away from the right hand. So when I'm assigning this, I know that it's basically an upside down triangle, so I start to draw the lines here. So I'll draw the line up here for lead 1, then I'll draw the line for lead 2. It's over on the right side because we usually start writing on the right side and then move to the left. And then over here we have lead 3. So when I'm assigning these actual charges, again, coming back to that rule, we want to put all the positive charges as far away as we can get them from the right arm. So here we have 2 negatives. So we have a negative in lead 1 and we have a negative in lead 2 assigned at the right arm. Over on the left arm here, we have a positive and a negative. And then down here at the feet, because we're as far as we can get away from the right arm, we have both positives. So a simple system like that will help you to remember where the different charges go. Now, these leads are just represented by this dipole set up from one place to another. So we have a charge difference, and what's indicated here is an arrow. And this arrow is representing this net electrical dipole. So it is representing all of the action potentials that are going on in one instant in the heart, but it's coming together and it's giving us the sum electrical movement. So that's what we're looking at when we see an ECG. Now, if you haven't had vectors before, it's an important concept to recognize, and you don't have to, do any math for this or anything else, but I want you to understand that vectors are used to represent physical quantities that both have a magnitude and a direction, and this is commonly used to represent forces in physics. For our purposes, we're looking at the net force of a moving charge. So that's what we're looking at. If you've not had vectors, I encourage you to, in the PowerPoint, click on this video link here. You won't be able to do it in the YouTube video here, but in the PowerPoint you will. It's going to bring you out to a Sol Khan video. He describes vectors. He talks about vectors. And if you're taking physics, if you haven't had physics yet, it's not terribly complicated, but it's going to help you a lot with understanding how this electrical force is going to be resolved when we're figuring out the ECG trace and what the deflections in the ECG trace will look like. So take a couple minutes to look at that and come back to this video after that. Okay, so hopefully you have a good feeling about the vectors. Now I want to try to simplify the deflections that we see in the electrocardiogram. Now, like I mentioned before, there's a current moving through the body. And this current is set up by a machine. So the machine that we hook up, and in this week it's the ADI Instruments Power Lab. In the picture that I showed, it was that crazy machine with all the buckets. All that's important is that you've established a current running through the body by having a negative and positive charge and a machine turned on that'll run that current through. Now, what's important is that the electrical charge that we're observing, so the net electrical dipole that's moving across the outside of our heart, is going to result in some type of deflection in the ECG trace. Now, if we're moving towards a positive lead, so in the situation of this man is sitting there and he's got the buckets set up, so basically he has a negative on his right arm and a positive on his left leg. What we see with this is that we have a negative wave sweeping over the outside of the myocardium towards the positive lead. So in this situation up here, what we see is a positive deflection in the ECG trace. And if you look at the heart and think about the actual atrial depolarization, so the beginning of the cardiac cycle, what we see with that is we see the negative charge sweeping across the outside of the cell towards the positive lead in the leg, and that results in lead 2 in a positive deflection. Now, in the case that we're moving in an other direction, so in this case we're moving with our negative wave sweeping over the outside of the myocardium away from a positive electrode. In that case, we're going to have a negative deflection, so a downwards deflection. Now, just to see if this makes sense, what we can do here is we can look at an electrical charge A and electrical charge B. And this electrical charge A is moving towards the positive. This arrow is moving towards this positive charge right there. And with this arrow going in that direction, what we see is a positive deflection. Conversely, this charge B is moving away from this positive electrode, and in that case, what we see is the negative moving away from the positive. We see a negative deflection here. Now, what I would do is I would redraw this diagram. And what I would do is I would just draw a couple circles here. And with these circles, instead of putting the positive in there, I'd put a negative sign. And then what I would do is draw what you think for the resultant deflections in the ECG trace. This is just a little exercise. In my labs, we'll do something like this next week, but it's to give you the idea of when we have a charge moving in this direction, first we think about, is it depolarizing or repolarizing? And if it's depolarizing, we think of it as a negative wave moving over the outside of the myocardium. If it's repolarizing, we think of it as a positive wave moving over the outside of the myocardium. So this exercise will help you to figure out what's actually going on in your ECG trace. And I encourage you to do that maybe a couple times before lab and come in and we can discuss it in lab. So now this is a lead 2 trace. And like I mentioned, because of the way that the heart depolarizes, we use lead 2 because we get really good deflections in each of the different waves that we observe here. So the ECG is actually going to represent a number of phases of the cardiac cycle. So here the P wave actually represents the depolarization of the atria. So this is not the atria contracting. This is the electrical signal that allows the heart to depolarize, and after that, yes, contraction will happen. It'll occur someplace in here, but we are actually looking at the electrical activity that occurs prior to contraction. So we're just observing electrical activity here. Now, as we move over here, we see the QRS complex, and boy, is this complicated. We have a downward wave, we have an upward wave, and then we have another downward wave, and it returns. Now, what we have going on here is we actually have the depolarization of the ventricles. So the depolarization of the ventricles is represented by the QRS complex. And something else that's in there is also the atrial repolarization. So that's buried within this entire QRS complex. It's not right here specifically, but it adds to this net electrical dipole that we observe at that moment. And then finally, we have a T wave, and the T wave represents ventricular repolarization. So this is when the ventricles are returning to their resting state from the electrical standpoint, and then they will soon relax from a contraction standpoint. So that is a basic PQRST. It's the cardiac cycle observed from lead 2. And when we ask you to measure these different areas in Power Lab, this is what you're looking for. So if we ask you for the PR interval, this is the area that you're actually going to give us a duration for. If we ask you for the QT interval, this is going to be the area that we're looking for with that. So become proficient this week in lab using Power Lab to actually bring out that marker and measure these different segments in the ECG trace. Now here is just a little animation of the actual propagation of electrical signal through the heart. And I'm going to just try to talk through this as it's going through. We have the SA node up in the top of the right atria that's going to begin the process in a second here. So that red dot is representing the SA node. It spreads across the atria. It hits the AV node. Then there's a slight delay. That slight delay then comes down and goes through the ventricles and allows us to contract the ventricles or send the electrical signal through to simulate the contraction of the ventricles. So as you look at this signal propagating through the heart, look at the deflections down below in the ECG trace. And this would be looking at a lead 2. So this is the lead that is going with the negative over here on the right arm and the positive down over here on the left leg. So think about, as we have this net electrical movement going in a certain direction, how this is impacting the current that's traveling through the body. So take a look at this. Hopefully it makes some more sense. If not, it will as we go through lab next week. And please have some questions to ask about this, because we can help explain it when we understand what's challenging about it. So just to look at a simple diagram here. This is going to be the same thing that I showed you. We have the SA node here, and the SA node is sending out a signal. These are the depolarized cells. It's represented by this electrical wave front. So here we have what used to be positive outside, and now we see this change where it's more negative going over the outside of the heart. And if we had to draw a net electrical dipole, we can draw this right over here in our Huggins Triangle, and we say, well, all these little individual charges going out in these directions are going to result in this net electrical dipole. So this arrow, this vector representing the magnitude and direction of the electrical force. So right here, we put this in the middle of Huggins Triangle, and here what we can do is when we put this out here, we can draw lines to our dipole lead. So basically this is our lead 2, and when we draw these lines out here, what we do is we see what the contribution is from this net dipole in the direction towards the positive, or maybe it's towards the negative in a certain lead. But in this case, we're moving towards the positive, so we can see that we're going to probably have the biggest deflection in lead 2 because we have this net electrical dipole going strongly towards the positive. So it's a negative wave moving towards the positive electrode down here in the left leg. Now this is the QRS complex. It's a bit more complicated. What we have in the beginning of the QRS complex is we have movement across the interventricular septum to the right, so over towards the right side of the heart. And soon after that, we have mostly a downwards wave moving with the R wave. So here we can see what a big contribution this makes to the lead 2, so going towards the positive, and with that we expect to see this big R wave. So the big spike in the ECG is because of this large depolarization of the ventricles. Large part of the heart, so we're going to see a large wave when all that electrical activity is occurring. Then finally, as we spread across the end of the left ventricle, because now we're just getting that left ventricle to push all of the blood out, finish this cardiac cycle, what we have here is spread back up towards the, and if we look at lead 3, it's easiest here, we have a spread of a negative moving towards a negative in lead 3. So here we see that negative deflection. Finally, in the bottom here, we have the ST segment. So the ST segment, what we have here is the heart is depolarized. So at this point, it's depolarized. It has contracted, or it's contracting at this point. And what's going to happen in just a second in the T wave is we will get a repolarization. So with the repolarization, we're switching and we're now having a positive wave traveling over the heart. So we'll look at that in just a second here. So breaking up each of the individual things, I have a couple diagrams, and I'm not going to talk through each of these, but we have a P wave diagram here. What you can see is during the P wave, we have the net negative charge moving down through the atria, and again, we know this is moving towards the positive in the left leg lead. Here we are into the QRS complex, and in the QRS complex, as I mentioned, we have some movement from the left to the right to begin, and we also have a strong downward movement. So we see this quick dip in the Q wave here going negative in lead 2, and then we see the big spike in the R wave going positive. And here, as the rest of the ventricles depolarize, this R wave gets even larger. And soon what will happen is we'll just spread back across the heart here, and that will be the S wave going back downwards. So S wave over here. And here is the S wave again, just finishing off. So it's spreading across this side of the left ventricle. And finally the T wave. Now the T wave is the different one here. Something different is going on from what I just explained. Here we have a repolarization wave. So a repolarization wave is going to be a positive charge moving across the outside of the myocardium. And in this positive charge moving across the outside of the myocardium, we then have a direction that is going to result in a positive deflection in lead 2. So now hopefully in breaking down those different sections, this is going to help you to understand what's going on in this diagram here. It goes through pretty well as far as showing the different contractions, and a great tool for this week's lab is actually going to be the visible body software. So as Dr. McCann used for you last week, those animations in the visible body software are included in your workbook, and I specifically set up questions that'll help you to think about the different animations within that visible body software. So once you've seen this explanation from me, I want you to check out what's going on in visible body, and we can talk about this in lab. It's very interesting to talk about, and I think that all of you are going to kind of enjoy using a little bit of physics, a little bit of electricity to learn about what's going on in our hearts. And finally, this is a tremendously powerful diagnostic tool to look at different cardiac pathologies. So in my lab, we talked about the heart attack this week and what that is. But a lot of different things can occur where we have some kind of abnormal conduction of the electrical system of the heart. And this can result in Well, it can result in death, but it can also result in some minor arrhythmias, so minor differences that might or might not cause problems for people. And in lab this week, we might notice that somebody has some kind of simple arrhythmia. We might notice that somebody has a pre-atrial contraction, which might be represented by, something like this, where we have contractions before the actual P wave go on. Some things are completely benign, so no trouble with them at all. And, when you are actually out doing your clinicals in the next few years, you're going to see ECG traces all over the place. And you might actually have the opportunity to work with diagnosing some of these things. And it's such a powerful diagnostic tool that we can actually tell when there are low oxygen levels in certain areas of the heart because of the leads that we're looking at and what's going on with those deflections. So it's a tremendously interesting science, and I'm really happy for the opportunity to introduce this to you today. I'm sure that it's pretty challenging concept to grasp, so maybe watch this video twice. I know it's a longer one, but try to get the way I was going with this, and hopefully it sets up a pretty good experience for you guys all in lab next week. It's one of my favorite labs of the year, so I look forward to seeing you in lab, and have a great weekend. Until then, we'll see you next week.